Hey peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the Butterick 6562 sew along. So today we're going to cover attaching the band, attaching the collar and straps, and finishing our shirt. So let's get started. So the next one is step number 16, and it's stitch the uninterfaced front band sections to the uninterfaced back band section at overarm seams, so the side seams basically. Remaining back band sections will be used as facings. Now you'll notice in this sew along that I've interfaced both of my facing and my outer band. That's because I've only got really lightweight interfacing available, which I wasn't confident it was going to provide the job that it would need to do with just one layer, so I've interfaced both sides. So that's the next thing that I'm going to do. You can see here the triangle markings. You want to make sure that you end up with a triangle matching up on the side of those pieces. So I've sewn my band together. I'm going to put that aside for now, and I'm going to work on the collar. So we want to stitch collar front sections to collar back at overarm seams, and we want to do that with both sets because you've got 4 of 7 and 2 of pattern piece number 8, so you're going to end up with 2 pieces that look like that, which you're then going to stitch together. Okay, so once the collar pieces are sewn together, and we're using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance there, you want to press them open, and then we're going to pin them together, and you're going to sew from one short edge along the outer rounded edge, the longer edge, and up the other side, and you're going to backstitch at the start and the finish. And once we've done that, I'm going to show you how I deal with the corners as well, because I reduce my stitch length, and I then, rather than pivot on a 90-degree angle, I take a couple of diagonal stitches with a shorter stitch length and then go around the corner. But again, I will show you as I go. Okay, so I've been sewing at my regular stitch size till about here, then I reduce it to 1.5, and I get to about here, and I take a couple of diagonal stitches, then pivot, then sew with my short stitch length for a while, and then return it to the larger stitch length. And so that just means that I can chop this off and then chop, because we need to trim all this allowance out so that we can get a nice crisp corner. So I'm going to trim all the long edges of these, and then at the corners I'm going to chop close to, but obviously not through, that line of stitching, just so that it can get a crisper point once I turn it all out. Okay, so I have turned everything out after clipping, and I have nice neat corners. So the next thing the pattern wants us to do is step 18, and for the facing it wants us to understitch one collar section as far as possible. So I'm going to reach under, and we won't be able to get right into the corners, but understitching is basically sewing as close to the line of stitching as possible, but sewing the seam allowance to for once this is going to be the facing, so this will be the under collar when we attach this to the shirt. So I'm going to do that now, and as I say, we won't be able to get right into the corners, but we're going to get as close as possible. There's my understitching, and once you've understitched, you want to, it tells you to baste the raw edges together and then stay stitch. Well, why not just stay stitch all in one go? So I've sewn a line of stitching at 3/8 of an inch along here, so that I can clip up to that if I need to when I'm pinning this collar to the front band that we made earlier. So I have my front band here, and you want to pin it so that the right side of the band is facing the wrong side of the collar, so the side of the collar that's got the understitching. You want this side to be facing up. Okay, so I have pinned the collar to the front band, so the right side of the front band is facing the side of the collar with the understitching, and the right side of the collar is up. First thing I did was match the side seams, or the overarm seams. Then I matched the notches, which are here. Then I found the centre of the back of the collar, and I found the centre of the back of the band, and I matched those, and then I put all the pins in between. So once everything is pinned together, the next step that it would like you to do is baste. So I'm going to run another line of stitching along this, which is at 3/8 of an inch, and that will baste those two together at the right points. Okay, so once we've done this, we can skip all these because these are for view D, which has the ruffle, which we're not doing today. So we're going to go to step number 26, and that's pin lower edge of band to upper edge of top, matching symbols and centres, stitch, trim, press seam towards band. Right, so you want to make sure that the band is about 5/8 of an inch hanging over the edge of the front button placket, and then pin. And then the next thing that I did was I found the centre of the back of the band and the centre of the back of the shirt, and I've pinned those together, and then I've pinned it all the way along, and you get to the little dot, and that's where the underarm should meet, and so you should end up with all of this bit free space, which is where your arm's going to go. So I've done the same on the other side. There's the small dot, but in all honesty, what I did, as I said, was I found the centre of the band, the centre of the back of the shirt, and pinned it together there, and then pinned it out from there as far as it would go, and it's met up with this dot here. And again, the same on this side, we have got 5/8 of an inch hanging over the front band here. So I'm going to sew this along this edge at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to back stitch at the underarm, and then move over and sew the back on, and then the other side here. So you want to sew 3 lots of stitching. It's starting to look like a top. So I have sewn it all the way around. I've trimmed my threads. I'm not going to press it yet because I've used a heat marker to put all of these marks on the band, and if I press it now then I'm going to lose all of those. So I'm going to move on to the next step, which is the shoulder straps, and it's fold them along the fold line, right sides together, stitch long edge, trim seams, seam allowances, turn right side out, press and baste the raw edges together. So basically what it wants you to do is fold these in half this way along this fold line and stitch it at 5/8 of an inch, turn it, trim it, turn it inside out and press. So we're going to do that. Here's the straps sewn together, trimmed and turned around, and as you can see I've pressed them as well, and one edge is slanted and the other edge is straight. So the slanted edge is the one that goes into the back, and this, the point here is where the square was, and this is where the small circles are. So if you have a look, and this is why I've not pressed this as yet, if you have a look at the this is the front band, or this is the back band sewn to the shirt. There's the large square and the small dot. So what we want to do is we've got step 29 on the outside pin shoulder straps to back, matching small circles and squares, having raw edges even and based. So we want to turn this so it's the right sides facing us, and then you want to take your strap and you want it to look like this. So we're going to have the angled edge pointing into, so that the point is going into the centre back, and we're going to find the square, which is there, and the circle, and you're going to pin it in place and then baste that into place. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to pin it all in and show you what it's going to look like when we're finished. Okay, so I've pinned my straps in and they're going at an angle, so we've got the angle point, the angled edge straight and the point going into the center, and it looks like our pattern does. So I'm going to baste these in, and then we're going to move on to the band section. Okay, so the next step is to stitch front band facing section to back band facing section at the overarm seams, which I have done. And again, this was the bit where you wanted to match up the triangle notch it, or the triangle shapes on the top of the band. So the next thing that it wants us to do is turn in the seam allowance on the lower edge of the band. So the next thing it wants us to do is turn in the seam allowance on lower edge of band facing, press, trim, press seam allowance to 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimetre. So the underside, or the lower side of the band, is the side that's opposite to the square marks, because that's where we've just, on the one that's attached to the shirt, that's where we've just attached our strap into, in between these two marks. So this is the lower edge. So we need to turn this up by the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then trim it. So the next step is number 31, and it's with right sides together, pin band facing to band over shoulder straps, matching symbols and side seams. Stitch leaving opening between large and small circles on the front and trim. Here's our large and small circle on the front, and this is where the other side of the strap is going to get inserted in the next stage. So we want to sew, and it's, as you can see here, we're sewing up the short edge and along the top edge as well. So I haven't pressed my band, which I was meant to do back here. I haven't pressed that as yet, so I'm going to go and do that so that everything is lying flat and that my seam allowances are all turned up, so that I'm stitching them together with the seam allowances taken into account in this section here. So I'm going to go do that now. Okay, so I've pressed this seam up into the band, which just means that the seam allowances at the side here are pointing in the right direction for when I sew it down, because we're going to start sewing from here up and pivot at this corner. And as you can see, I've actually pressed this facing on the inside to be a little bit longer than the outside, and that just is a preference of mine, because it just means that when I'm top stitching this down, which is going to happen at a later stage, I am guaranteed to catch it. Now the next thing that you want to note is that you don't want to sew between the small dot and the large circle, so I've actually put in orange pins. I don't have red pins, this is the closest I can get, so I know that I need to backstitch here, leave this open, backstitch here, and then sew across the back. And then same on this side, when I get to the large circle, I'm going to backstitch, stop there, leave this open, backstitch here, and sew all the way to this edge here, and then pivot and turn down and sew down there. So yes, that's what we want to do. And I'm actually going to sew from this side because we want to sew as close to this edge as possible. So I'm going to sew with this side up because that will just make that much easier. Okay, so once we've done all that, you need to trim down the seam allowance. So I have done that all the way around. I've cut it down by half, and then at the corners I've really clipped back so that there's going to be a nice point, but I do leave this bit intact because it just makes sewing it down at the final stage a little bit easier if you don't have a tiny seam allowance to be working with here. Now I'm going to turn this out and then I'm going to press it. Now the pattern does call for me to understitch the facing to the seam allowance, but as I'm not going to do that because I'm also not going to slip stitch this bit closed. I'm going to top stitch around the whole box because I've top stitched along the front here and I think that's going to tie it in nicely, and I personally prefer the way that looks. I like how machine stitching looks on shirts and things like that, so that's my personal preference. Having thought about it as well, I can't see any reason why I can't have put the straps in at this point and just sewn over them. The thing you need to make sure that you don't do is get them twisted. So I'm actually you know what, before I press it, turn everything out, I'm going to put these into the right place and stitch them down at the same time. So I'll show you what I'm doing as I do it. Okay, so I actually do agree with them that you should leave the straps till this point, but there's no reason for you to have to slip stitch them in later. Okay, so the reason that the pattern is saying to do it later is so that you can put them in, pin them, try it on, and then adjust the fit if you need to. So actually I'm going to do that now. I'm going to baste these in, and all I've done is I have taken, so I make sure that the strap is not twisted. I've inserted it in between the circles. This gap is actually much wider than the strap itself, so I have centered the strap in that gap. So as I say, I'm going to baste this in. I'm going to do the same on the other side, try this shirt on and see what I think, and if I need to shorten it I shall do, and if I need to lengthen it then I might need to cut a new strap, but fingers crossed I won't need to. So yeah, I'm going to baste this in and try it on. So I've tried it on and actually the length is pretty good, but the position is actually a little bit off. I need it to move it a little bit further into the center at the front, and then unfortunately I also need to do the same at the back, which means I have a lot of unpicking to do, but that's okay. It's going to be worth it, and it's only a little bit. And this is one of the things about trying it on at this stage, is that you can decide if the straps do need to be moved about. So I'm going to do that now, and then I can press everything and top stitch this facing. Okay, so the pattern then asks you to slip stitch the facing all the way around, but as I mentioned, I'm actually going to top stitch my down, and I'm going to top stitch all the way around the entire thing, so along here, pivot up there, and along the top as well, because it's going to tie in nicely with how this is finished. And again, that's how I like my shirts to be done. It does say here that you can edge stitch the lower edge of the band if you want to, which is basically what this is going to be doing, but I'm going to do it the whole way around because I think that's going to look nice. And I've got my straps into a good position for me, so I had just unpicked the back and moved it in 5/8 of an inch that way, and then I've moved the front in to one of the markers as far as it would go. So yeah, they're sitting nicely on me now. So I'm going to use my blind hem foot again for my top stitching, as we discussed earlier, and I'm going to go the whole way around the band. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, top stitching is done. Not that you're going to see much of it anyway, because the collar is going to cover that. So we're on to the final stretch. The next thing that it would like us to do is make a 5/8 of an inch narrow hem at low edge, easing fullness as necessary. Okay, so narrow hem. So as I've mentioned before, every pattern has a glossary, and this is what they say for a narrow hem. Turn in hem, press, easing fullness if necessary. Open out hem, turn again so raw edge is along crease, press, turn in along crease and stitch. Okay, so you can do that, but we are working with some curves and some pointy bits, so what I'm going to do is run a line of stitching at 3/8 of an inch the whole way around this, so that I have something as a guide to press up evenly, and that's also going to help me get this point nice and pointy. Okay, so I wanted to do one side of this to see if I could do it the way I wanted to do it, and I've basically done a narrow hem the whole way around, but not quite as the pattern described. I've trimmed it back. So I sewed my first line of stitching at 3/8 of an inch, pressed that over, and then sewed on top of that line of stitching again, then trimmed back that seam. Here we go, this is a good way to, because I haven't done this side yet. So yeah, I sewed 3/8 of an inch, which is that line there, pressed it over so that the stitching line was on the inside, and then stitched again at that 3/8 of an inch to stitch that down, and trimmed back to that line of stitching, and then I've pressed it over again. Okay, so with this corner I folded it over the point into the center, and I've folded it so that this is a blunt edge. Now I've stitched this side down, and when I fold this side in, it's not a super pointy edge, but it's a decent edge, and I'm gonna top stitch it down there, and I'm actually going to trim off all this excess. And with this one, which is one that I have done, I've just put some fray check on there as well, so that's what it looks like from the right side. As you can see, my back stitching is not brilliant, but yeah, it's worked, and it's all enclosed the raw edges. The other bit that's quite difficult is this curve here. So as again, you can see top stitching is not brilliant there, but I've done the same thing, and with the first line of stitching I actually clipped into the curves, and again I should be able to show you on this one because I've not top stitched this down yet. So with this one I clipped right up to the line of stitching so that I could bend this around, and then I have pressed this down, and I'm just going to, I don't pin this down as I sew. I just sew it, so I'm going to hold it down, manipulate the fabric around to try and make sure that there are no puckers at that point. So this is actually quite a difficult piece, and what I think for the next one would be quite good is maybe a facing of some kind. I'm working with a very well-behaved cotton here, but I can see myself wanting more of these shirts in floatier materials, especially with the big sleeves on it. So this particular part might be quite difficult to hem. So I'm thinking maybe I might take the placket off of this completely and have a separate placket piece, and then draft a facing for the bottom of this shirt. Possibly might do that. Not 100% sure yet, but when I tried it on I really like it. So I'm just going to finish this one, and then we're going to do buttons and buttonholes, or buttonholes and buttons, in that order. Okay, the final step is number 37. It says using guide for buttonholes and buttons, mark location for buttonholes on right front and for buttons on left front. Now, because I have shortened mine, I didn't actually trace out this the buttonhole placement guide. So what I'm going to do is use my Simflex, and then I've also seen that there was another lady who's made this top, and she put the button on the top band, and then she put another one directly underneath it, because the band is quite thick, and that was so it would lie flat. And if you notice here as well on the pattern, the buttonhole on the band is horizontal, and then on the placket going down they're all vertical. Now I actually prefer to do my buttonholes horizontal, because with pulling, if you have any pulling whatsoever, if you have vertical buttons, that can make it very obvious, but if you have horizontal buttons, the pulling can be lessened. So I'm going to do horizontal buttonholes the whole way down. So I'm going to get my Simflex out and mark where I want my buttonholes to be, and as I say, I'm going to put the one on the band here, and then I'll put one right underneath it and go from there. Okay, so I have my Simflex out. This thing is worth its weight in gold. I've decided on the buttonhole right underneath the band, so I've marked that one in, and then the Simflex, I've decided on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buttons on the band, and so the Simflex will then give you even spacing for your buttonholes. So I'm now going to make those on my machine. My machine is very easy for making buttonholes. I kind of just tell it how big the button is, and then it does the rest of the thing for me. So I'm not going to give you an instruction on how to make buttonholes, because every machine is very different. And as I say, this one, if I gave you instruction on how to make buttonholes on this machine, great, but if you don't have this machine, then you need to use whatever your machine is and the instructions that are provided with that one. So I'm going to make my buttonholes, and then I'm going to sew on my buttons, and then we're done. So whilst I'm not going to show you a tutorial on how to sew buttonholes on my sewing machine, because obviously not everybody has my sewing machine, I will show you what I do with them once they're sewn. So the very first thing that I do is I put fray check over the stitching, both on the front and the back of the buttonhole. And once that's dry, I then take a pin. So I put the pin in through the underneath the end of the buttonhole, and just pretend that this hasn't been opened. So I take my seam ripper and I go into the end of the buttonhole, and then I seam rip my buttonhole open. Now if you get a little bit too happy with the seam ripper and it gets away from you, you can't go any further and rip through the end of your buttonhole, because you have a pin in place. So that's how I like to open my buttonholes, in that manner, once the fray check has dried. And again, I've already sewn my buttons on, but so the way I like to get the placement for my buttons is I will pin the two plackets together, and I will then take another pin and I'll pass it through the buttonhole through to the other side, where I then use my friction pen to make a mark where I want my button to be, and I mark all of the button placement that way so that I get an accurate placement for my buttonholes. So that's how I treat that final step. Once you've done that, your top is finished. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comment section down below and I'll do my very best to answer. As I mentioned, this particular pattern was picked by my patrons on my Patreon page, so I would like to say thank you to all of these lovely people who took the time to vote on the particular pattern that they wanted to see. And I think you will notice my mum's name floating along down there at the same time. Yes, mum she started off as a $1 Patreon and then realised that she didn't get voting privileges, so she's upped it to $5, much to my dad's dismay. Thanks, Mom! If you'd like to be able to vote on upcoming sew-alongs, head over to my Patreon page and have a look at the tiers. If you would like to support me, that would be amazing. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!